During the summer of 1942, the Axis forces in southern Russia resumed their offensive, attacking through the Don steppe towards the Caucasus and the Volga. Initially, the attacks made good ground. The Soviet front, weakened by a disastrously mishandled offensive in May, buckled and then broke. But as the Axis armor and infantry poured over the plains, Soviet units, falling back in disarray, regrouped and fought a number of important delaying actions at Rostov, Voronezh, and most importantly, in the great bend of the River Don. These actions, coupled with misunderstandings and indecisiveness amongst the German High Command, enabled a stand to be made on the west bank of the Volga. The place chosen was a sprawling industrial city, commanding the river traffic and the road and rail routes to the south. The Battle of Stalingrad was to be the decisive turning point of World War II. As the fight for the city developed, both Hitler and Stalin became locked in a contest of wills. Amid the rubble and carnage, their forces fought for streets, houses, sometimes even rooms. With the onset of winter came the Soviet counteroffensive, the destruction of the Romanian, Hungarian and Italian armies, and the encirclement of the mighty German Sixth Army. In the spring of 1943, when the dust finally settled over the Don steppe and over the fire-blackened ruins of Stalingrad, Hitler's war of conquest had become a battle for survival. In Stalingrad, he had tried to break the Red Army at the furthest limit of its retreat. Instead, he had all but broken the Wehrmacht. For the Red Army, the battle was more than just a great victory. It was in every sense a turning point. Morale was restored. Officers and men enjoyed a new status and respect. And the dark cloud of failure that had dogged the army for years was dispelled. The battle also marked the beginning of the march west, the reconquest of Russia, and the drive through Eastern Europe to the gates of Berlin. With Barbarossa, Hitler had planned to conquer the Soviet Union in a single season's campaign. But by December 1941, the Red Army had still not been destroyed. Moscow had not fallen, and much of the industry and agriculture of the South still lay beyond his grasp. Now he faced a new and unfamiliar challenge. He had made no plans or preparations for a winter campaign, and no major offensives could be contemplated before the spring of 1942. Until then, his soldiers would have to hold the line, confronting the inevitable counterattacks, while supplies of winter clothing, ammunition, and low-temperature lubricants were hastily sent forward. When the first supply trains reached the front, they were met enthusiastically by men bowed down by acute shortages of essential supplies, by chronic immobility, and by the cold. But the respite was not to last. The German armies in Russia were at the extreme limit of their extension, far from their main supply bases and vulnerable to a quick counteroffensive. The blow fell sooner than anyone expected. On December the 6th, the Russians attacked along a 600-mile sector of the front. In the first phase, the Soviet aim was to pinch out the German salients west of Leningrad and to the north and south of Moscow. Under remorseless pressure, the Germans were gradually driven back. But there was no decisive breakthrough, and in January, buoyed by his early successes, Stalin ordered a general offensive. Initially, the attacks made good ground. Soviet pincers closed around Demyansk and Vyazma, and threatening attacks were made towards Smolensk and Bryansk. But despite these early successes, the Soviet offensive soon ran out of steam. By March, the Germans had recovered, stabilized their lines, and secured the neck of the Vyazma pocket. Only at Demyansk was there any serious prospect of a major Soviet victory. Here, a large part of the German 16th Army had been surrounded. Hitler, however, would countenance no withdrawal and ordered that the 92,000 men trapped in the pocket hold their positions. For 10 weeks, the encircled forces were supplied from the air, enabling them to mount repeated attacks on all sides of the ring until, eventually, at the end of April, a land corridor was opened to the west. With the spring, both sides prepared to resume the offensive. While the German High Command decided to stabilize the front at Kharkov in advance of larger operations in the summer, the Russians, unknowingly, chose to attack through the same sector to maintain pressure in the south. Kharkov had been occupied in October 1941 and had already seen one Soviet counterattack. This had been carried out as part of Stalin's January offensive and had left the Russians holding a vulnerable salient on the west bank of the Donets. On May the 12th, the Russians opened their offensive with concentric attacks on either side of Kharkov. In both sectors, the attacking forces broke through, and a serious threat to the city began to emerge. In response, the Germans accelerated the preparations for their own offensive, launching it 5 days later. Attacking northwards, German armored formations spearheaded a drive into the neck of the salient, slicing adrift the entire Soviet left wing. In the last days of May, the Kharkov pocket was systematically reduced. Of those encircled, only 22,000 managed to escape. 70,000 Russian soldiers lost their lives, and a further 200,000 were taken prisoner. Almost all of the Soviet equipment committed to the battle was either destroyed or abandoned. The battle was a disaster for the Red Army, comparable to the great defeats of the first year of the war. The whole of their southern wing had been shattered. Large sections of the line were now held by skeleton formations or by units cut off from their command and communications posts. For the Germans, the battle had been a far greater success than even they realized. Having removed the Kharkov salient, they now stood ready to mount a further strike into the south, unaware of the extent to which the forces facing them had been fundamentally weakened. Indeed, at the beginning of June, the wide expanses of the Don Steppe and the Caucasus lay virtually undefended. For Hitler, the conquest of Russia was an overriding priority. If Germany was to survive and prosper, she would need to achieve self-sufficiency in food, fuel, and raw materials. These would have to be won by force of arms and incorporated within an ever-expanding Reich. Only in Russia could he find such resources in sufficient quantity to free Germany of all external dependencies. In fact, Hitler's plans for Russia flew in the face not only of all common morality, but also of common sense. Territorial conquest was to be followed by a ruthless program of Germanization, in which subject populations would be reduced to serfdom or exterminated. In much of Western Russia, where the German invaders were initially welcomed as liberators, this was to breed resentment and defiance. In the unconquered territories to the east, it merely strengthened resolve. In earlier campaigns, the General Staff had been able to exert a restraining influence, curbing, though not controlling, Hitler's extravagance. But with each great victory, their influence had declined as his confidence had soared. Convinced that his superior intuition was an adequate substitute for generalship, he increasingly interfered in operational planning and in the ongoing control and direction of campaigns. By 1942, he had assumed the post of Commander-in-Chief of the Army, in addition to his other offices as Führer, Supreme Commander of the Armed Forces and Minister of War. This was a position of immense power, unfettered by considerations of moral accountability. Yet in the East, his plans and perceptions were colored by cruel prejudices and pathological hatreds. In them lay the seeds of disaster. By 1928, Stalin had emerged as Lenin's heir and the undisputed master of Russia. Suspicious, vindictive, and cruel, his ascendancy to power marked the beginning of a period of wholesale repression, during which the apparatus of the state would be gradually extended into every facet of Soviet society. In the 1930s, he embarked upon a program of rapid industrial development, increasing armaments production and expanding the Red Army. In 1937, with these processes underway, he initiated a series of purges of the Red Army's officer corps, simultaneously extending political surveillance and control of the army through the commissariat and the secret police. These measures, while massively increasing the army's peacetime strength, gravely undermined its operational effectiveness and profoundly damaged morale. An indifferent performance in 1939 against the Finns was inevitably followed by a catastrophically inept defense against the Wehrmacht. In July, while German armies were slicing virtually unopposed through Western Russia, he assumed overall command of the Soviet armed forces. As supreme commander, Stalin enforced a rigid policy of no retreat, resulting in the greatest series of military disasters in history. With the onset of winter, he regained the initiative, but by overcommitting his few reserves, failed to capitalize on the exhaustion and disarray afflicting the Wehrmacht. By the spring of 1942, he had squandered more than 6 million lives, yet appeared neither distressed nor despondent. Stalin's authority was by now based almost entirely on fear. Thousands of Red Army officers had already been shot for disobedience, desertion, or treason. Those that remained knew that their lives depended on operational successes, and that they alone would bear responsibility for failure. Hitler's campaign in Russia had not only gravely overextended the Wehrmacht, it had placed huge strains on Germany's industry and dislocated her economy. Interim measures were taken to streamline production and ensure the continuing flow of supplies to the front. But the underlying problem remained. Germany's resources were simply inadequate to the prosecution of a long war. In the planning of Barbarossa, Hitler had established clear objectives. The capture of Leningrad would secure the Baltic and connect Germany to her Finnish allies. Control of the Moscow region would ensure German dominance of the road and rail infrastructure and deprive the Red Army of its communications system. But it was in the south that the great economic prizes were to be won. The grain fields of the Ukraine would be the breadbasket of the new Reich. The mineral wealth of the Donbass and the oil fields of the Caucasus would provide the necessary resources and raw materials to wage war indefinitely. In the event, the offensive had fallen far short of its aims. The repulse before Moscow had been perhaps the greatest military setback, but it was the failure in the south that most concerned Hitler. Although the original objectives of Barbarossa still remained valid for any future conquest of the Soviet Union, Hitler knew that his armies were too weak to achieve them all in a single year. Immediate priority had to be given to the south. Only by securing this fertile and economically rich region could he be assured of the means to continue the war. In April, he outlined his plans for the main campaign of 1942. This would be codenamed Plan Blue and would take the form of a two-pronged offensive. The overall objectives of Blue would be the destruction of the Red Army's southern front, the consolidation of the Ukraine west of the Volga, and the capture of the Caucasian oil fields. As the offensive neared, a large-scale transfer operation was set in motion to augment the existing divisions in the crucial southern sector of the front. Other sectors were to be reduced to 50% of strength, and the armies of Hitler's allies were plundered for all the spare divisions they could yield. By June, 52 such divisions had been added to the order of battle in the east. These included units from Hungary, Romania, Italy, Slovakia, and even volunteers from Spain. Hitler would now have some 74 divisions available for the start of Plan Blue, 54 of them German. Of these, 9 were armored and 7 motorized. 8 further divisions on their way to the front would act as a strategic reserve. In addition to this, more than half of the Luftwaffe's available strength in the east was to be committed to the battle. The offensive was planned to take place in 3 distinct phases, allowing the Germans to control the direction of the battle and to maximize the limited forces at their disposal. Spearheading the attack would be the 4th Panzer Army, supported by the 2nd Army and the 2nd Hungarian Army. These forces would advance from the region around Kursk towards Voronezh on the Upper Don. Once the Don had been reached, the infantry would dig in and consolidate the new front, while 4th Panzer would turn south and continue to advance downriver. In Phase 2 of the offensive, set to take place 2 days later, the 6th Army, stationed near Kharkov, would attack eastwards, then swing parallel to 4th Panzer and advance down the corridor between the Don and the Donets. Phase 3 would take place a few days later, with the 1st Panzer Army striking east and south across the Donets towards the lower Don, flanked on its right by 17th Army and with the 8th Italian Army in reserve. These movements were expected to result in a series of encirclement operations in the Donets corridor, in the Great Bend of the River Don, and between the Don and the Volga. While these pockets were being liquidated, the left flank of the offensive would be anchored on the Volga, and the main thrust turned south towards the Caucasus. The first phase of Blue would open on the 28th of June, and in the weeks preceding the attack, supply schedules were accelerated as men and equipment were funneled into the battle zone. In all probability, this would be Hitler's last opportunity to win a decisive victory in the East. The outcome of Blue would fundamentally determine the future direction of the war. In June, an unnatural quiet settled over the Eastern Front. While the Germans completed their preparations for Blue, the Russians built up their defenses. The Soviet High Command knew that an attack was imminent. The only uncertainty was where and when the blow would fall. Stalin was convinced that the attack would be launched by German Army Group Center and that the overall objective would be Moscow. An obvious target was the huge salient projecting westwards between Demyansk and Vyazma. An attempt to pinch out this salient was regarded as being virtually inevitable, but this would most likely be undertaken in preparation for, or as part of, a wider offensive. Initially, Soviet planners expected the main thrust to be led by the 2nd Panzer Army stationed outside Oryol and directed northeast through Tula towards Moscow. However, information received by the southwest and Bryansk fronts indicated an attack out of the Kursk region towards Voronezh and the Upper Don. The Soviet High Command believed this to be the spearhead of the main German summer offensive. The objective, they surmised, would be to unhinge the southwest and Bryansk fronts, and from Voronezh sweep north and east in a massive encirclement of the Moscow region. Stalin's obsession with the defense of Moscow, to the detriment of other sectors of the front, was based on political and military calculations rather than economic ones. Certainly, the Moscow region was an important center of industry, upon which the Red Army depended, but its value as the nerve center of the Soviet Union was inestimable. As well as the seat of government, it was the center of administration, of communications, and of all the higher command echelons, both of the army and of the state. In Russia, more than any other country, the concentration of power in the capital had invested it with a strategic significance out of all proportion to its economic or even military importance. The defense of Moscow was therefore given the highest priority and allocated the greatest concentrations of men and equipment. In the spring, Stalin had abandoned the system of theater commands, relying instead on the loose coordination of individual fronts, of which there were 8 facing the 3 German army groups in the east. The defense of Moscow was entrusted to 3 fronts: the northwest, Kalinin, and western fronts. Between them, these accounted for well over half the available frontline divisions in the Soviet order of battle. South of Moscow, facing Kursk and Oryol, the Bryansk and southwest fronts accounted for a further 20% of Russian strength. But to guard against the threat from this sector, Stalin had deployed 2 tank armies, the 3rd and the 5th, between Voronezh and the capital. West of Voronezh, 2 belts of fortifications ran south and southeast for 150 miles. In the target sector, the southern and North Caucasus fronts were perilously weak, accounting for no more than 10% of frontline divisions. Though neglecting to reinforce this sector, Stalin had ordered fortifications to be constructed around Rostov, Stalingrad, and Saratov. In reserve, there were a further 10 armies. These were stationed well behind the front and concentrated around Voronezh and Moscow. Though still in the process of formation, many of these armies would play a central role in the battle to come. In keeping with his aristocratic Prussian origins, Fedor von Bock was an ardent nationalist and a stern disciplinarian. Promoted to the rank of Field Marshal in July 1940, he was given command of Army Group Center for the attack on Russia. As a soldier, Bock was tough and aggressive, qualities much admired by Hitler. But he was also uncommonly outspoken, a license Hitler extended only to those successful in battle. It was Bock's army group that took the main force of the winter counteroffensive, and his recommendation for a withdrawal ensured that he would be among nearly 40 senior generals dismissed for defeatism. Within a few weeks, however, the unexpected death of Field Marshal von Reichenau brought Bock back to favor. In January, Hitler named him as Reichenau's replacement in command of Army Group South. Zhukov was one of only a handful of senior officers in the Red Army to have survived the purges of the 1930s, and as a result was one of the few generals it had left with any professional experience or training. In 1941, with the threat of war looming, Stalin appointed him Chief of the General Staff, and with Marshal Timoshenko, Commissar of Defense, he was charged with bringing the Red Army to battle readiness. With the surprising suddenness of the attack and the terrible reverses suffered on the frontier, both men were given front commands. Both proved able. Timoshenko in the south, Zhukov in the defense of Leningrad and Moscow. In 1942, however, their paths diverged. Timoshenko's fall from grace began with the disaster at Kharkov, while Zhukov, the hero of Moscow, emerged as Stalin's most favored general. As a soldier, Zhukov was energetic and fearless, demanding total commitment from his subordinates and immense sacrifices from his men. Like Stalin, he was a natural fighter, committed to offensive operations regardless of the cost. At the gates of Moscow, the Wehrmacht had suffered the first serious reverse in its hitherto relentless march of conquest. Paralyzed in the grip of one of the coldest winters on record, and buffeted by incessant counterattacks, it had been gradually driven back. Yet, although shaken, the front had held. Hitler's refusal to sanction any major withdrawals had undoubtedly prevented a general rout, and saved millions of marks worth of equipment, but at the cost of hundreds of thousands of casualties. Not until the end of March, when the spring thaws rendered further fighting impossible, was the Wehrmacht able to take stock of its losses. Many of the divisions that had held the most threatened sectors of the line were reduced to 1/3 of establishment. Thousands of tanks, trucks and heavy weapons had been given up, either to the ice or to the Russians. Of the 162 divisions deployed in the east in April, only 1/3 were considered fit for offensive operations, and of these, only 8 were regarded as fully combat ready. More than anything else, mobility would prove the Achilles heel of Blue. The available transport was at best barely adequate to the task. There was no margin for the kind of errors that occur inevitably in all military operations. Even the Panzer armies, established in 1941, were now heavily diluted with infantry divisions, gravely compromising their ability to conduct large-scale operational encirclements. Despite its prominent role in the early Blitzkriegs, the Mark III was gradually being rendered obsolete by the appearance of larger, heavier, and more powerfully armed tanks. Although fast, reliable, and agile, it had proved impossible to outgun the model sufficiently to maintain its leading role in the panzer forces. Nevertheless, production of the Mark III continued throughout 1942, while the search for a replacement was underway. Mark III chassis, however, proved eminently suited to conversion as self-propelled guns. Dispensing with the turret enabled armor protection to be increased to as much as 80 millimeters, and the longer recoil of heavier weapons contained within the body of the vehicle. Large concentrations of self-propelled guns and Mark III battle tanks would be essential to the success of Blue. The Mark IV first appeared in the 1930s as an infantry support tank and proved itself to be highly effective against both infantry and artillery positions. In 1941, however, alarmed at the apparent superiority of Soviet tanks, Hitler demanded the immediate modification of the Mark IV to equip it for anti-tank duties in the absence of any available alternative. Armor protection was substantially enhanced, and the short-barreled 75mm howitzer was replaced with a longer, high-velocity anti-tank gun. Suitably modified, the Mark IV gained a new lease of life and would remain in production until the end of the war. In view of the importance with which the German army invested its tank arm, it was perhaps inevitable that German anti-tank weapons would be equally well designed. Yet the gun which emerged as one of the most feared of all weapons in the German arsenal was actually designed not as an anti-tank gun, but as an anti-aircraft gun. First used in adversity against tanks during the war in Spain, astonished flak crews quickly realized that their 88mm anti-aircraft guns possessed a tank-killing potential well in excess of any other gun then in service. The high muzzle velocity and extraordinary accuracy of the gun were perfectly suited to an anti-tank role. Indeed, so well suited that by 1940, all anti-aircraft guns were fitted with telescopic sights and all flak crews trained to engage tanks. In the early stages of the war against the Soviet Union, the Wehrmacht found to its horror that the only truly effective weapon it could deploy against the best Soviet battle tanks was the 88. Even in mid-1942, the 88 remained the Wehrmacht's main anti-tank weapon in the East. And in the build-up to Blue, every panzer division would be given its own battalion of 88s for use against tanks or aircraft. Even in 1942, the Junkers Ju-87 remained one of the most effective aircraft available to the Luftwaffe. More commonly known as the Stuka, this aircraft had played a pivotal role in the early campaigns, before its combat deficiencies became apparent in the Battle of Britain. Transferred to the Eastern Front with enhanced armament and increased armor protection, it gained a new lease of life. Although still no match for single-seat fighters, in German-dominated skies, and in particular over the wide expanses of European Russia, it still retained the power to deliver paralyzing blows. In independent operations, or in support of ground forces, Stukas would be heavily committed in all phases of the campaign. The Luftwaffe's principal frontline fighter throughout World War II was the Messerschmitt Bf 109. The F-series, introduced in the spring of 1941, incorporated a number of improvements on the aircraft that had so narrowly failed in the Battle of Britain. With a redesigned fuselage, a new propeller, and a larger, more powerful engine, it was considerably faster and had a higher service ceiling than its predecessor. In the first year of the war in Russia, Messerschmitt pilots had racked up huge scores, partly through their own flying skill, but also because they possessed a far superior aircraft. In the east, the Messerschmitt was yet to meet a serious challenger. In the spring of 1942, the officers and men of the Wehrmacht had every reason to expect that their exertions would yet bring them victory. True, they were not as strong as they were in the summer of the previous year, but nor were their enemies. In their march through western Russia, they had destroyed the best part of the Red Army, killed or captured well over 6 million Russian soldiers, and seized more equipment than the factories of the Reich could produce in a year. They justifiably regarded the Red Army as a shambles, tactically incompetent at all levels, and redeemed only by the raw courage of its individual soldiers. By contrast, they saw themselves as seasoned professionals. Even those facing combat for the first time did so confident in their own abilities and in those of their comrades. Underlying this conviction were the solid foundations of training and discipline. Thoroughly schooled in the techniques of modern warfare, German soldiers were also expected to demonstrate personal initiative. On the field of battle, the ability to act quickly and effectively under pressure was highly prized. Soldiers of all ranks were trained to be adaptable, to be aware of the wider tactical situation, and to be able to assume commands higher than their own rank. By Western standards, discipline in the German army was harsh, but much more was expected of a German soldier than had been demanded of his British or French counterparts, with all too predictable results. It was this combination of far-sighted and effective training programs, sound battlefield experience, and excellent modern equipment that had brought the Wehrmacht so close to victory in 1941. In the end, the soldiers of the Wehrmacht had fallen victim to circumstances largely beyond their control. With the return of summer, they gathered their strength and prepared to resume the advance east. During the spring and early summer of 1942, the Red Army suffered a number of catastrophes, of which Kharkov was merely the largest and most damaging. In the Crimea, it had lost a further 200,000 men, as well as vast quantities of equipment, and in the center and north, half as many again. No other nation or government could have sustained these losses, yet the Red Army and its leadership remained unbroken. This was partly due to the seemingly inexhaustible reserves of Russian manpower and to the single-minded ruthlessness of the Soviet government. But it was also a reflection on the extent to which the Soviet Union was geared up for war. In 1941, the German High Command had been shocked by the sheer size of the Red Army and by the volume of equipment captured during the first phases of the campaign. Much was obsolete, but there was ample evidence that the Russians also possessed a range of modern, highly effective weapons, and, more disturbingly, the capacity to manufacture these in quantities that Germany could never hope to match. Many of the armaments factories had been overrun, but more had been saved, stripped down, and shipped east to be rebuilt beyond the reach of the Wehrmacht. Though full production would not resume until 1943, enough was reaching the front to maintain the army's defensive capability. Moreover, the experiences of the past year had forced a rationalization of the munitions industry. Obsolete weapons would be phased out, and those of proven value given priority of resources. Although not often credited, Soviet tank design was, by 1940, superior even to that of Germany. Most of the work had gone into heavy tanks, and this bore fruit in the superlative KV-1. The KV-1 anticipated by some years the need for increasing thicknesses of armor. In fact, the KV-1, when it first appeared, was the most heavily armored tank in the world, and by far the most formidable. Its principal weakness, as with most heavy tanks, was its relatively slow speed and limited range. It was also comparatively costly to produce. For these reasons, KVs only ever formed a small part of Soviet tank strength. Widely acknowledged as one of the most successful tanks ever built, the T-34 achieved an outstanding balance of the three fundamentals of tank design: firepower, mobility, and protection. When it entered service in 1940, its high-velocity 76.2mm gun was well in excess of the armament carried by German tanks. This, combined with superior armor protection, gave it a deadly advantage, which it retained well into 1942. The T-34 was also ideally suited to the climate and conditions of Soviet Russia. An exceptionally rugged suspension system and wide tracks gave it full mobility in all seasons and over all but the most impassable ground. On top of all these qualities, the T-34 also had the advantage of being cheap and easy to manufacture, and by the end of the war, over 53,000 would have been produced. More numerous than any other aircraft ever built, the Ilyushin IL-2 was one of the most successful ground attack fighters of the war. First flown in 1939, the single-seat prototype proved underpowered and underprotected. These faults were later remedied with the installation of a more powerful engine and the addition of a second crew member manning a rear machine gun. Strikingly simple in design, it carried more than half a ton of armor and was one of the earliest fighting planes to be rocket-armed. Though less sophisticated than most Western aircraft, its combination of survivability, excellent handling in all conditions, and outstanding control at high attack angles helped form its excellent reputation. Popularly known as the Sturmovik, the IL-2 was greatly feared by the Germans and was regarded by the Red Army as one of the most important weapons in its arsenal. The most successful Russian fighter of World War II was only just entering production in June 1941, and within weeks, the entire production line was transferred 1,000 miles to the east. Despite this dislocation, production was quickly resumed, and by the end of the year, 500 Yak Model 1s had been rushed into service. Like the Ilyushin, the Yak was simplicity itself, solid, reliable, and easy to maintain. It was also to prove an outstanding fighter, particularly in its later marks. The addition of a more powerful engine resulted in the Yak 7, which replaced the Yak 1 in production from early 1942 onwards, and by the spring of that year, the Yak 9 was already in development. This incorporated increased armament, and when it entered service in August, would prove far superior to any existing German fighter. By the end of the war, these three models would account for 37,000 aircraft, the largest production run of fighters in history. Even in 1942, although well equipped, the Red Army was still disorganized and inefficient. Virtually nothing now remained of the 1936 officer cadre. Most of those lucky enough to survive the purges of the 1930s had been killed or captured in the first year of the war against Germany. Major operations were now commanded by men with little or no military training, and in some cases, even less ability. Amongst senior officers, there was an almost complete lack of tactical subtlety, little regard for life, and an overwhelming reliance on the application of brute force. Throughout all levels of the army, discipline was increasingly maintained through terror and what passed for morale by crude but ceaseless propaganda. Exhortations to ever greater sacrifices made no mention of ideology, and instead appealed directly to the Russian soldier's sense of history and patriotism. This was itself a significant turning point in the war, a tacit acknowledgement of the excesses and mistakes of the past, and a grudging recognition that the Red Army's soldiers would fight harder and longer for Mother Russia than they would for socialism. In the battles to come, they would need almost superhuman endurance. In training and tactics, they were no match for their adversaries. But amid the rubble and carnage of Stalingrad, they would achieve, with only their own resources of courage and resolve, one of the most famous victories of the war. While the German armies in the Ukraine prepared to resume the offensive, those in the Crimea entered into the last phase of one of the most horrific sieges of the war. Since November of the previous year, the Soviet Black Sea port of Sevastopol had been invested by two armies, the Romanian 3rd and the German 11th. The city was a natural fortress, set amongst a tangle of rocky bluffs, ravines, and steep cliffs. In 1941, its defenses had been augmented by 3 lines of fortifications, and its garrison bolstered by reinforcements and by troops evacuated from the southern Ukraine. Early German attempts to storm the city had made little headway, and much of the winter was spent in wearing down the Soviet defenses through air and artillery bombardment. In May, the Germans completed their clearance of the eastern Crimea with the elimination of a threatening Soviet bridgehead on the Kerch Peninsula, thus enabling them to concentrate all their efforts on Sevastopol. To break through the labyrinth of defenses and reach the high ground dominating the harbor, the Germans brought up a fantastic array of heavy mortars and railway guns, amongst them some of the most awesome weapons ever built. With the capture of Sevastopol, the last pocket of resistance in the rear would be liquidated. Axis forces, numbering some 200,000 men, would be released for service elsewhere, and morale throughout the Wehrmacht would be boosted considerably.